There is a quiet moment many people know but rarely name. Evening settles in. The door closes. The noise of the world fades. And instead of feeling trapped, the body exhales. The shoulders drop. The nervous system softens. For some, that moment feels more honest than any crowded room or well-lit social space. And yet, almost immediately, a second voice appears. What's wrong with me? Why don't I want more? Staying in is often misread as laziness, avoidance, or fear. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal from life. But psychologically, it is often something else entirely. It can be a form of architecture, a protective structure built by the psyche to preserve stability, dignity, and coherence when the outer world has felt overwhelming, unpredictable, or emotionally unsafe. Not a defect, not a failure, a response. For many men especially, the home becomes more than a place. It becomes a symbol, a kind of inner fortress, a controlled environment where nothing sudden is demanded, where no performance is required, where the nervous system does not have to stay braced for impact. After seasons of emotional chaos, criticism, public exposure, or relational volatility, predictability begins to feel like oxygen. Silence becomes restorative. Familiar walls begin to function like a womb, enclosing, regulating, holding. This is where the cultural collision begins. We live inside a value system that rewards visibility. Be social, be ambitious, be seen, be outgoing, be everywhere. And for some nervous systems, that equation works. Visibility feels like possibility, but for others, especially those shaped by earlier experiences where being seen meant being judged, shamed, overwhelmed, or emotionally cornered, visibility does not register as opportunity. It registers as danger. When a nervous system learns early that attention brings threat rather than connection, it adapts. It learns to lower exposure. It learns to minimize stimulation. It learns to associate safety with invisibility. Over time, this adaptation can harden into preference. Not because the man is broken, but because his system learned something very specific. Staying inside keeps me intact. The problem begins when this self-protection is misnamed, when withdrawal is treated as pathology, when a man absorbs the idea that his desire for quiet, for home, for limited contact, is something shameful that needs fixing. Shame is not a neutral force. It doesn't motivate growth. It traps energy. It turns intelligent adaptation into self-criticism. Instead of asking, what happened to me? What did my system learn? The question becomes, what's wrong with me? That shift matters more than it seems. Because once self-protection is mistaken for pathology, the man is no longer listening to his body. He's arguing with it. And when a person stops trusting the signals that kept them alive, they don't become freer. They become divided. From a Jungian lens, this is where the shadow quietly forms. Not as something dark or evil, but as something unlived and misunderstood. Parts of the psyche that stepped back to preserve safety are later judged as weaknesses. The psyche learns that even its survival strategies are unacceptable, and that internal split creates a particular kind of exhaustion. The kind that doesn't come from doing too much, but from constantly defending who you are against who you think you should be. There is an emotional stake here that rarely gets named. When self-protection is pathologized, insight is replaced by shame, and shame does not lead to integration. It leads to hiding, not just from others, but from oneself. The locked door stops being a choice and becomes a verdict. So, this is not a conversation about convincing anyone to go out more, socialize harder, or override their instincts. It is a conversation about understanding what staying in actually means, about slowing down long enough to hear whether this preference is rooted in clarity or in memory, whether the home is a place of restoration, or a place where life has quietly narrowed. As you listen, you might notice sensations in your body, a sense of relief, or resistance, or recognition. There's no need to push any of that away. Just notice it. Let it be data, not a diagnosis. The nervous system speaks first in sensation, not in language. And stay with this, because when we reach the midpoint, we'll expose the pattern men miss most. The one that quietly turns homebody from a personality label into a psychological signal. One that, once seen, changes the question from why am I like this to what is this protecting and what might it be costing. There is a common misunderstanding about withdrawal. It is often framed as a present-day choice, a decision made in real time. But for many people, withdrawal is not a strategy chosen now. It is a memory being replayed in the body. The nervous system does not operate on philosophy or intention. It operates on association. And once an association is learned, it can persist long after the original context has disappeared. For some men, novelty does not register as excitement. Crowds do not register as opportunity. New social situations do not feel neutral. They feel charged, not because something bad is happening now, but because something bad happened before, and the body remembers. This is the hidden driver that rarely makes it into conversation. The nervous system has linked unpredictability with emotional threat. What others experience as stimulation, the body experiences as risk. From a trauma-informed neuroscience perspective, this makes sense. When the brain has learned that emotional environments are unstable, critical, or overwhelming, the amygdala becomes vigilant. It scans for threat even in ordinary situations. Over time, that constant readiness drains the system. Cortisol remains elevated. Energy drops. The body begins to prefer environments that require less vigilance, less interpretation, less self-monitoring. Low stimulation becomes not a preference, but a relief. This is why the desire to stay in often has little to do with disinterest. It is not that the man does not want connection. It is that his system has learned that connection comes with a cost he can no longer afford. So the body makes an intelligent choice. It chooses regulation over performance. It chooses stability over exposure. What looks like avoidance from the outside is often the body saying, "I need to stay within my window of tolerance." This is also why certain signals go unnoticed or misunderstood. One of the most telling signs is not boredom when plans are cancelled, but relief. A quiet sense of space returning to the chest, breathing deepening without effort. Another sign is mental clarity increasing indoors. Thoughts organize themselves. Creativity returns. The mind feels less fragmented. These are not the markers of apathy. They are the markers of a nervous system exiting a defensive state. Jung might describe this as the psyche compensating for imbalance. When the outer world has demanded too much adaptation, the inner world pulls back to restore equilibrium. The problem is not the movement inward. The problem is when that movement is never understood. When it is explained away with a story that sounds like personality, but is actually protection. This is where beliefs quietly form. If the body remembers danger, the psyche builds explanations to justify staying hidden. Stories like, "People drain me. I'm just better alone." Most social interaction is pointless anyway. These beliefs are not lies. They are incomplete truths. They describe the experience of a dysregulated system, not the full range of what might be possible under different conditions. Over time, the belief hardens. It becomes part of identity, and identity feels safer than uncertainty. Once something is named as who I am, it no longer needs to be examined. The system can rest, but there is a cost to this rest. Because when beliefs are built to protect the body from remembered danger, they also limit future learning. They keep the nervous system from discovering that safety might exist outside the walls as well. None of this means the body is wrong. On the contrary, it means the body has been doing its job, protecting, regulating, conserving energy. The question is not whether withdrawal was justified. The question is whether the conditions that required it are still present. And that question cannot be answered intellectually. It has to be felt, tested gently, and approached with respect for the pace of the nervous system. If you notice yourself nodding along, there is no need to draw conclusions yet. Awareness comes before change. Insight comes before movement. For now, it is enough to recognize that what you may have been calling avoidance could be memory. What you may have been calling disinterest could be self-preservation. And this sets the stage for what comes next. Because when memory drives behavior, identity often steps in to make it feel permanent. 2 chapters ahead, we'll look at a real survivor story that reframes isolation entirely. But first, there is a subtler layer to examine, the one where identity becomes a psychological alibi, and preference becomes a place to hide from unresolved pain. I'll continue with the next chapter when you're ready. At a certain point, experience turns into explanation. The psyche does not like unanswered patterns. When something repeats often enough, the mind looks for a story that can contain it. This is how identity begins to form around adaptation. not consciously and not dishonestly, but protectively. For many men who prefer staying in, the label introverted becomes that container. It offers relief. It provides language. It stops the interrogation, both from others and from within. Once the preference has a name, it no longer needs to be examined. It simply is. And there is a quiet safety in that. But Jung made an important distinction between identity and wholeness. Identity is what the ego uses to remain stable. Wholeness is what the psyche moves toward over time. When an identity forms primarily to protect against shame, rejection, or unresolved pain, it can quietly harden into what Jung called the persona, a mask that was once useful, now worn too tightly. In this sense, introversion can become less a temperament and more an alibi, not a lie, but a partial truth that prevents deeper inquiry. It becomes easier to say, "The world drains me," than to approach the more vulnerable reality. I was never taught how to feel safe in the world. One statement describes preference, the other touches a wound. This distinction matters because the nervous system does not respond to labels, it responds to experience. If early relational environments were marked by unpredictability, criticism, emotional flooding, or withdrawal of affection, the body learned a lesson before language was available. Connection costs something. Later in life, that cost is interpreted as exhaustion. The world feels draining, not because it inherently is, but because it activates unprocessed memory. Identity steps in to organize this experience. It offers coherence, and coherence is regulating. The danger is not in having an identity. The danger is in mistaking identity for destiny. When a label becomes a full stop instead of a comma, development freezes. This is where the Jungian distinction between persona and shadow becomes relevant in everyday terms. The persona is not false. It is functional. It is how we survive and belong. The shadow is not bad. It is what has been pushed out of awareness to maintain that survival. When a man says, "I'm just introverted," what may be hiding in the shadow is not extroversion, but longing. Longing for connection that feels safe. Longing for expression without exposure. Longing for contact that does not require self-erasure. Fear of rejection often hides here, disguised as self-definition. Perfectionism can quietly take root as well. Social selectivity becomes a virtue that masks the terror of being seen imperfectly. Standards rise not because clarity has increased, but because vulnerability feels too costly. Again, this is not a flaw. It is an adaptation that once made sense. Cultural mirrors reinforce this process. Online spaces, especially long-form discussions, can romanticize withdrawal as insight, solitude as superiority, and detachment as intelligence. There is comfort in finding one's experience reflected and validated, but reflection without challenge can become stagnation. When avoidance is reframed as enlightenment, the psyche loses its invitation to grow. Jung warned that, whatever we do not consciously integrate, we are compelled to live out unconsciously. Labels stabilize pain, but they also freeze movement. They give the nervous system rest, but they deny it new learning. Over time, what began as protection can become confinement. This does not mean the identity must be rejected. It means it must be held lightly, with curiosity instead of certainty. With room for complexity, a man can value solitude and still question what shaped his need for it. He can honor his limits without turning them into walls. He can recognize temperament without using it to bypass unfinished emotional work. At this point in the arc, nothing needs to be decided. This chapter is not about abandoning introversion or forcing change. It is about noticing where explanation replaced exploration, where a name offered safety but quietly postponed healing. Because underneath identity, something else is operating, something quieter and more biological, a pattern of reward and relief that begins to shape motivation itself. And when we reach that layer, the conversation shifts from personality to chemistry, from preference to pattern. That is where the midpoint turns. Up to this point, staying in has made sense. It has been framed as memory, regulation, protection, and identity. All of that remains true. But here, the conversation reaches a quieter and more uncomfortable layer, one that has less to do with meaning and more to do with chemistry. Because beyond psychology, the nervous system is also governed by reward. Home is not only emotionally predictable, it is neurochemically efficient. Inside familiar walls, stimulation is controlled. Screens deliver small, reliable hits of dopamine. Routines reduce uncertainty. Cortisol stays low. Nothing unexpected is demanded from the body. Over time, this environment becomes not just safe, but rewarding. From the brain's perspective, this is elegant. Dopamine responds to predictability just as much as novelty, especially when the system is fatigued. After burnout, emotional overload, or prolonged stress, the brain stops seeking challenge. It starts seeking reliability. Home becomes a refuge where reward is guaranteed and cost is minimal. Social connection, by contrast, works differently. It carries the promise of oxytocin, but oxytocin is not free. It requires exposure, uncertainty, emotional risk, the possibility of misattunement or rejection. For a regulated nervous system, this risk feels tolerable, even exciting. For a system shaped by earlier unpredictability, it feels like standing on unstable ground. So, a quiet shift occurs, not consciously and not morally. The brain begins to favor environments where reward is certain and risk is low. Motivation slowly reorganizes itself around comfort. What begins as recovery subtly becomes a pattern of avoidance, not because the man fears life, but because his reward system has learned where relief lives. This is where the reversal happens. Safety without challenge does not stay neutral. Over time, it erodes vitality. Dopamine that once restored now merely maintains. Energy flattens. Drive fades. Not dramatically, but quietly. Peace turns into numbness. Rest turns into stagnation. And because nothing is obviously wrong, the cost goes unnamed. There are stories like this that rarely get told out loud. Men who survived intense burnout or emotional collapse and retreated into solitude to heal. At first, the quiet worked. Sleep improved. Anxiety softened. The system stabilized. But months later, something else appeared. Motivation did not return. Curiosity dimmed. Ambition felt distant, not because it was rejected, but because it no longer sparked anything. What looked like peaceful solitude was masking a reward system collapse. Not depression in the dramatic sense, just a slow draining of aliveness. The nervous system had found a way to avoid pain, but it had also stopped seeking expansion. This is the moment where many narratives lie. Culture often frames staying in as either healthy self-care or unhealthy avoidance. The truth lives in between. Regulation is necessary. Retreat can be intelligent. But when retreat becomes the primary source of reward, life narrows without announcing itself. Some men notice this only indirectly. They track mood and see nothing alarming. But when they pay attention to energy, something becomes clearer. After days of isolation, drive does not increase. After brief, tolerable social exposure, something subtle shifts the next day. Not joy, not excitement, just a quiet sense of forward movement returning. The system remembers that aliveness exists beyond control. What begins as regulation can quietly become retreat from aliveness, not because the man chose comfort over growth, but because his nervous system learned to survive first and forgot how to reach. This is the midpoint, because it reframes the entire story. Staying in is neither weakness nor wisdom by default. It is a phase whose meaning depends on what it is serving. And beneath chemistry, beneath habit, there is still another layer shaping the preference for home. This is where most explanations stop, but the deeper question remains. Why does safety feel more reliable in places than in people? Why does control feel easier than trust? That is where the next chapter turns. Beneath memory, beneath identity, and beneath chemistry, there is a relational imprint that shapes the entire pattern. It is rarely dramatic. It does not always involve obvious abuse or neglect. Often, it is subtle enough to be dismissed, yet strong enough to organize a life. For many men who feel safest at home, early emotional environments were marked by unpredictability. A parent whose moods shifted without warning. A caregiver who was loving one moment and critical the next. Or a presence that was physically there but emotionally unavailable. In these environments, connection did not feel steady. It felt conditional. The child learned not what love was, but how easily it could change. When emotional safety is inconsistent, the nervous system adapts by prioritizing control. Control becomes the substitute for trust. If people are unpredictable, then environments must be regulated. If emotional space feels volatile, then physical space becomes the refuge. The body learns that solitude offers something relationships could not: reliability. Jung might describe this through an archetypal image. The wounded child, carrying unmet needs and unspoken fear, is guarded by a sentinel. This sentinel is not cruel. It is vigilant. Its task is simple: prevent re-exposure to humiliation, engulfment, or abandonment. It scans for loss of control. And when social situations begin to feel emotionally cornering, the sentinel tightens the perimeter. This is how repetition compulsion quietly operates, not as self-sabotage, but as dignity preservation. Choosing solitude over relationship becomes a way of avoiding reenactment. The body remembers what it was like to want closeness and feel diminished by it, so it chooses distance instead, not because intimacy is unwanted, but because its cost once felt too high. Social spaces often activate this wound in ways that are difficult to articulate. The trigger is not conversation itself, but loss of control, being watched, being evaluated, being emotionally influenced by others' expectations. These moments echo earlier dynamics where autonomy felt fragile. The nervous system responds as if something essential is at stake. This pattern appears across cultures, though it wears different clothing. In high collectivist societies, where public reputation and family honor carry immense weight, men who experience public shame often retreat into private domains. The home becomes the only place where the self is not under surveillance. Withdrawal in this context is not antisocial. It is restorative, a reclaiming of inner territory after external exposure felt punishing. Avoidance, then, is not about rejecting people. It is about protecting dignity. But dignity preserved in isolation comes with a quiet cost. Intimacy requires risk. Growth requires friction. And when safety is found only in controlled spaces, the psyche adapts by shrinking its reach. This is not a failure of courage. It is a consequence of learning. The system learned that people could not be relied upon to hold emotional space safely, so it stopped asking them to. Over time, the preference for home becomes less about comfort and more about predictability. The walls do not surprise you. They do not judge you. They do not change. Yet the same mechanism that protects also limits. Avoidance shields the wound, but it also prevents it from healing. The sentinel keeps watch, but it also keeps distance. And distance, when it becomes permanent, slowly starves the parts of the psyche that grow through contact. This is the tension at the heart of the pattern. Home feels safer than people because at some point, people were not safe. That truth deserves respect, not correction. But respect does not require resignation. Understanding the wound does not demand that it remain in charge forever. As this arc moves forward, the question shifts again. Not toward forcing exposure, and not toward dismantling solitude, but toward discerning its purpose, whether staying in is serving repair or preserving exile. That distinction belongs to the final movement of the story. There is an ancient tension carried quietly inside this pattern. It appears across myths, philosophies, and psychological systems, not as pathology, but as initiation. The tension between withdrawal as exile and withdrawal as incubation, between the hermit and the king. The hermit archetype steps away from the world to preserve life, meaning, or sanity. The king archetype returns to the world to embody order, responsibility, and creative authority. Neither is superior. What matters is sequence. When withdrawal happens without return, it becomes exile. When withdrawal serves preparation, it becomes right. For many men who prefer staying in, the confusion lies here. Solitude began as protection. It later became regulation. And at some point, it stabilized into habit. The question is no longer whether solitude is good or bad. The quieter question is whether it is gestating something or merely maintaining safety. Philosophers have named this distinction in different ways. Nietzsche wrote about solitude not as escape, but as forging ground, a place where values are clarified away from noise, where strength is refined rather than displayed. Machiavelli spoke of strategic withdrawal, not as retreat from power, but as preservation of it. Both understood something subtle. Stepping back only matters if it eventually changes how one steps forward. From this perspective, the meaning of staying in shifts. It is no longer about hiding from the world, nor about proving independence from it. it becomes about inner ordering, about aligning instinct, thought, and value without constant interference. The home becomes less a bunker and more a workshop. This is where the body gives different signals. Healthy solitude does not produce numbness. It produces clarity, not manic productivity, but clean direction. The mind organizes itself. The body feels inhabited rather than collapsed. Resentment toward the world decreases, not because the world is avoided, but because inner coherence is growing. There is also a difference in emotional tone. Exile feels heavy. Time blurs. Days slip past without contour. Incubation feels quiet but alive. Time has texture. There is a sense of something forming, even if it cannot yet be named. The nervous system is not merely avoiding stimulation, it is conserving energy for expression. This reframes the entire pattern. The question is not, do you stay in, but what is being prepared? What inner order is forming away from noise? What clarity is being shaped before it meets resistance? Solitude gains meaning only when it is oriented toward eventual return. The king does not emerge by rejecting the hermit. He emerges because of him. The inward phase allows for sovereignty that does not depend on approval, reactivity, or performance. When a man has ordered his inner house, he does not need to dominate space. His presence carries structure quietly. This is where staying in stops being passive. It becomes directional. There is an outward expression waiting somewhere on the horizon. Not loud, not rushed, but real. Work, craft, service, or responsibility that carries the imprint of inner coherence. Visibility no longer feels like threat, because something solid now stands behind the eyes. Solitude earns its meaning only when it eventually returns something to the world. Without that return, it collapses back into safety. With it, the home becomes a place of renewal rather than retreat. One final movement remains, because even preparation must eventually integrate with life. And that integration does not ask for force, it asks for discernment. The final chapter holds that crossing. There is an image that brings all of this together without force or judgment. The image of a hearth. A hearth is not a bunker. It is not a place to disappear. It is a place where warmth is gathered so that life can continue beyond the walls. Fire that never leaves the hearth eventually suffocates itself. Fire that is carried outward becomes light. The home in this sense is not meant to imprison. It is meant to warm. It offers rest so that the body remembers safety. It offers quiet so that the psyche can reorganize. But its purpose is not endless enclosure. Its purpose is renewal. A true preference for staying in emerges only after choice, not fear. When fear leads, the door closes defensively. When choice leads, the door closes intentionally and opens just as deliberately. The difference is subtle, but it changes everything. One narrows life, the other supports it. Safety and exposure are often framed as opposites, but psychologically, they are stages. Safety comes first. Without it, nothing integrates. Exposure follows when safety has done its work, not reckless exposure, not performative socializing, but contact that is chosen, measured, and grounded in inner coherence. The nervous system does not need to be shocked into growth. It needs to be accompanied into it. Reclaiming agency lives here, not in becoming more social or less social, but in deciding, in sensing when solitude is serving growth and when it is quietly stealing life, in noticing whether the locked door feels like a hearth or a hiding place, whether it restores strength or merely delays aliveness. This discernment does not arrive all at once. It develops slowly, through attention rather than pressure, through listening to energy instead of mood, through respecting the body's history while not allowing it to dictate the future entirely. If parts of this reflection mapped onto your own experience, that recognition matters, not as a diagnosis and not as a verdict, but as orientation. Sometimes the most meaningful signal is simply naming what has been invisible. If you choose to leave one line below, let it be that signal, not an explanation, just a line. Often, seeing another person name what you quietly carry is enough to loosen isolation into understanding.